Hello. Hello, this is Mike Byram. I'm speaking to you from France, where I'm spending the summer. And I'm sorry I cannot be with you in Taiwan, but that's the way the world is at the moment. It's sad that the pandemic has changed everything. It reminds us, however, that we human beings cannot control everything, and that we must live with it for the duration, as my parents used to say about the Second World War, which they experienced. A duration for them which was longer than I hope the pandemic will last. But it's a reminder. It's a reminder that human beings make catastrophes and make problems, not only the natural world, and it's in our relationship with the natural world that many of these problems arise. I'm saying this not simply because of the pandemic, but it's a reminder about the bigger picture. In the bigger picture, I hope and believe has a significant role in dealing with both natural and human problems and the relationship of human beings with the natural world. Education must deal with that, and language education has got its role to play in all of that. And I'm going to start with an example of language education dealing with a natural phenomenon and the relationship of human beings with the natural world. But I could have given another example, which would be about human interactions and wars and so on. That's also a theme which I could have taken. But that's the context. That's the context in which we live. And I'm convinced that education must play a part in all of this. So let me start with my topic as such and my title. I'm going to talk about intercultural citizenship in foreign language education and what that means and how that can be done. But then in the second part, I'm going to talk about the ethical issues involved. So the part one, the background to all of this, will be, first of all, an example, and then to look at the intercultural communication and competence theory, and in particular, critical cultural awareness, but then to combine this with Politische Bildung, which is a German phrase which I'll come back to in a moment. The second part will be focusing upon the ethical issues and the teacher's perspective, the ethical issues which arise when controversial issues are involved, and how the teacher might have three possible options, and the whole question of education and transformation. So let me start in part one with the example. I want to begin with a scene somewhere in the United States, and a quote from this recent publication. The scene is a group of middle school students chatting excitedly as they prepare to be interviewed for a radio show, a local radio show. The students have been collaborating with students in another country to create advertisements that raise awareness about the world water crisis and conservation. The primary languages of the two groups of students are different, but they work together in their foreign language classrooms, and they work together successfully in mixed groups. On the radio show, they'll be talking about how they've learned to understand each other's water consumption customs and the significance of water shortage in their respective communities. And they'll be talking about the existing efforts that the existing efforts in their own communities and in each country and community. But that was their discovery phase, and they had to find out about each other's community and situation, and the crisis affects the whole world, and then to seek possible solutions towards improving the situation in their local community. So this is the end stage where the students are eager to talk about what they've produced, what they've created together with their partners in the other country, their partners whose language they're learning. They've used the target language. They've collaborated on media platforms such as Skype and other online discussion forums. And they've shared and discussed and investigated each other's ways of dealing with the water crisis, and then developed their products, their ways in which they're going to raise awareness in their own community about these issues. In doing so, they've used not only their language lessons and what they learn in language lessons, in other words, their communicative skills, but they've brought in what they've learned from social studies and mathematics and science classes. And that helps them to look more deeply into the problems and find appropriate solutions. So in the radio program, the students talk about the products that they've made, their videos that they've made, their comics, their pamphlets, their ways, different kinds of ways of raising awareness. They know that sharing these outcomes from their efforts may help, and they hope they will help fellow citizens to become aware of how they can have a positive impact on the world by addressing the water crisis in their own community and far beyond. In addition, they also know they may receive feedback from the community that can challenge their ideas and extend their understanding of the problem, the solutions that they're thinking about, and their understanding of their own community itself. All of that as a consequence of working together at an international level and then bringing it back to their local level. That's the example. There are two aspects of this example I want to focus upon. The relationship of language teaching with education for democracy. And secondly, the fact that the teachers were in a complex ethical position. So in both of these dimensions, I'm drawing on work and help from numerous people. But I would particularly like to mention Fabiana Cardetti and Manuela Wagner and Melina Porto, with whom I've been working on these matters for some last few years. But above all, I would like to mention my late friend Peter Dwyer, who introduced me to the whole notion of Politische Bildung. So first, let me consider the relationship of language teaching to education for democracy. I used that notion Politische Bildung a moment ago. It's a German phrase which literally means political education, but I'll show in a moment that it is more than that, and that's just the literal translation. That phrase lay behind my original concept of critical cultural awareness and savoir s'engager, which is a French phrase which literally means know how to become engaged, and is a deliberate allusion to the French notion of engagement, of political social engagement. I am, after all, a child of the 1960s. But the teacher's ethical position in all of this will be something that I'll come to. These two dimensions, and in particular that first dimension, are reflected in policy aspirations. I want to give you a couple of examples from Europe. I speak now as a European, which is more important to me than being British, especially at the moment. What is important today is that in some European countries, it has become education policy that learning democracy should be part of all teaching in all subjects. In language teaching, this can take a special form. In language teaching, the focus is not only on us and our country and our democracy, but also on international dimensions of democracy and on internationalism. Not nationalism and not chauvinism, which are growing everywhere in the world, but internationalism. For example, in policy statements in Norway and in Portugal, it's clearly stated that there's a link to education for citizenship in language teaching. In Portugal, it's a link to national citizenship, implicitly at least. But they do say that learning languages supports the development of an inquiring, analytical and critical attitude, contributing to educating active, engaged, and that's the key word here, engaged and autonomous citizens. In Norway, they go a step further. That, by the way, is from the curriculum for English in Portugal. In Norway, they go a step further, where they say that there's a link between language teaching, international citizenship and democracy. And they say good competence in languages will also lay the ground for participation in activities which build democracy beyond borders and beyond differences in culture. I could give you other examples from other countries, from Germany, for example. I'm not saying that this has been realized in Norway or Portugal or Germany. It's important to remember that policies don't necessarily reflect reality, but are aspirations, inspirations, if you like. Policymakers want to lead us towards a new way of doing things. And I think it's the responsibility of all of us as teachers to realize and implement those policies. And the example I gave at the beginning of the water crisis is an example of how some teachers are trying to indeed realize and implement such aspirations. Although in that case, rather, it was in the United States of America, but I've been working together with Manuela and Fabiana to try to combine this European way of thinking with projects in languages and other subjects. What about Taiwan? In Taiwan, I don't yet see the link with languages. What I do see is that there is in the curriculum goals a statement about civic responsibility. And I find that this key phrase, democratic literacy. So the goal, this general educational goal, is to enrich students' democratic literacy and so on. And well, again, we find some interesting phrases here. International understanding and national identity and self-responsibility. Well, I will want to say international understanding and international or internationalist identity and self-responsibility. And that would be brought from language teaching. But it's also interesting to see that phrase in the middle of the second paragraph, that students can learn to respect cultural and ethnic identity and social justice, and internalize the concept of global citizens. And then a little further down, there's reference to resource preservation, ecological sustainability, exactly the kinds of things that we find in the water crisis project. But yet I don't yet see a link to language teaching. That's the situation as I see it in Taiwan. I hope I have not misrepresented that. That's what I've found. Behind this project, such as the water crisis project, this way of thinking, there is some theoretical thinking. First of all, the notion of intercultural communicative competence. A model of intercultural communicative competence, which I produced some 20 years ago now, where there are elements which are familiar to the language teacher: linguistic competence, sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, which the language teacher teaches. But then there's all these other competences which make up intercultural competence: knowledge about other countries and groups of people, knowledge about how intercultural competence works, how stereotypes and prejudices can hinder good intercultural communication, skills of interpreting and relating, of discovering, of finding things out in the way that the students in the Water Crisis Project had been using their skills to talk to each other and discover each other's ways of thinking about the water crisis. Relativizing self and valuing others, thinking about what we take for granted and what other people take for granted, and thinking about how their views of the world are just as valuable as ours. And centrally to all of this, critical cultural awareness. Critical cultural awareness is defined as an ability to evaluate critically and on the basis of an explicit, systematic process of reasoning the values present in one's own and other cultures and countries. Other cultures, even other cultures within one's own country, and that might be dealt with by other subjects such as history and geography and social studies, but other cultures and in other countries where we also need the language to understand, and that's the particular responsibility of the foreign language classroom and the foreign language teacher. So critical cultural awareness is one crucial theoretical concept in the kind of work that I've been describing. I want then to combine that with this idea of politische Bildung and with the larger notions of education for citizenship. Bildung is a complex word. It's usually translated as education, but it's got a complex German history and a German educational tradition. But it's not the time today to go into all of that. But what's important is that Bildung and politische Bildung, education and political education or social education, has four crucial elements: self-reflection, capacity for judgment and critique, autonomy, and maturity. There's a lot of overlap here with the notion of critical cultural awareness. So I want to try to combine, and that's what we did in the theory behind the example I've given you, to combine politische Bildung with critical cultural awareness. I'm sorry, I keep going in the wrong direction. But politische Bildung, or as it's now often called Demokratie lernen or learning democracy, has three orientations. The first is the cognitive orientation. That is, that there should be a teaching of concepts, knowledge, and modes of analysis for the understanding of political phenomena. Or, if you don't like the word political, some people find that's too risky as a word, too complex or too loaded as a word, then just replace it with social, because that's what the students in that example were doing. They were dealing with social phenomena, but political simply means getting engaged. And that's why I like the word political as well as social. The political phenomena, understanding concepts and knowing how to analyze. Now, what we can add from the foreign language perspective is an international dimension to that. It's not just concepts and knowledge from our own world, our own democracy, our own society, our own country, but an understanding and acquiring knowledge about other countries, cultures, and societies, adding an international dimension to that cognitive orientation. The second orientation is what is called evaluative, where The purpose of Politische Bildung is to explain and mediate values and to teach people to the ability to make political, or if you like, social judgments on the basis of these values. Those values in our situation will be democratic values. That must be, of course, clear. Now let's add to that perspective the foreign language perspective, which leads learners to respect the norms of other societies and other social groups, and to evaluate them in an unprejudiced way, in the way described under particularly the notion of critical cultural awareness. The third orientation is an action orientation. Developing the ability and the readiness for political or social engagement with others in our society. That's what is meant by action orientation in Politische Bildung. From foreign language teaching, those others become others not from our society, but usually from another country, or perhaps from another language group in our own country. But it's people who are from another way of thinking and who speak another language, and the interaction, therefore, is of a different kind. It's an interaction which is with others through a foreign language, which is an extension of engagement with people in one's own country. So what happened in the water crisis example is that the students interacted through the internet, through Skype and all the rest of it, with students from another country, and gained thereby an extended and international perspective on engagement and what they can do in their own society. And then they came back to their own community and did something in their own community, informed by and enriched by that international perspective. That then is the first part of my presentation, to try to give you an idea of how intercultural education and intercultural citizenship can be developed in practice. But in the second part, I want to come to the ethical issues involved, which I developed particularly with Melina, Otto, and Manuela, who I would like to thank for their help with this. It's axiomatic for me that education should cause learners to become engaged with the world as it is here and now, with their world in the present. We're not only preparing them for the future as future citizens, for the world when they grow up and they've left education, because they're already citizens, they're already grown up in whatever their age, whether they're 5, 15 or 25. And it's the ethical implications of this, what I would call a professional creed or belief of engagement, which I now want to address. First of all, it's important to remember how influential teachers can be, especially with young learners. Many years ago, when I started all this, we did a research project trying to find out what children and young people learn in addition to language skills and communicative skills. What do they learn in addition to, in a language classroom, what do they learn in addition to communicative skills? And we asked children what they knew about other countries. We wanted to know what they learned in French lessons, in addition to French as a language. In Taiwan, you might ask children what they learn in English lessons, in addition to learning to speak a lingua franca. You might want to do that because you think that it's important in English lessons to have an educational purpose, and that just teaching communicative skills is not enough. I would certainly take that view. I hope you would too, but that's that's something to think about. So in our research, pupils rather, would often say, the learners would often say, when we ask them about, what do you know about France since you've been learning French? They would say things like, oh, well, Miss says that in France they do this and they do that. Miss is the word they use about the teacher, and it's a word which indicates their respect for what she's saying. And sometimes they said, oh, I remember in the first year or 2 years ago, Miss said this and that. So they remember things that Miss said. Miss is an important person. But my question is, what should Miss do? What should the teacher do if she's not only telling them about France, not only just giving them knowledge about another country, but she's, as in the water crisis example, encouraging them and even requiring them to get politically or socially engaged, to be political or politisch, to use the German word, to get involved in controversial issues and moral decisions. Because when one does introduce controversial issues, things like the environment and green crimes, as they're sometimes told, there are moral judgments made. The teacher is an influential, significant other. The teacher encourages, perhaps, as I said, requires some kind of political, social action. And this then leads to ethical dilemmas. We know from experience in other subjects, such as social studies and history and so on, that there are three possible options that the teacher can take. Three possible positions and stances that the teacher can take. The first one is what can be called neutral. Miss can stay neutral or attempt to do so. She can try to just introduce students to a controversial topic such as the water crisis. But the very choice of materials, the very fact that they've chosen this topic to teach them and to be part of the teaching in her classroom reveals that she has, implicitly at least, values and opinions, that she thinks this is an important issue. So neutrality is not really a possible option. It's one which is discussed, but I don't think it's really a valid and viable option. The second is a balance option or position, where she makes sure that all perspectives are given space and time. She also ensures that learners recognize the power of rhetoric and persuasion and can analyze their own response to rhetoric and persuasion from other people or from the materials that they're looking at. That balance also allows her space to make her own position clear. She doesn't have to be neutral, but she has nonetheless to remember that she's a powerful person, a significant other, and what Miss says is often remembered for years to come. A third position, therefore, is what's called commitment. She can take a position of commitment. As a teacher, she decides that it's appropriate to introduce controversial issues. As a teacher, she's also going to give direction to learners. She's going to attempt to transform them so that they're willing and ready in their turn to transform the world, not just when they grow up, but as they experience it here and now. That's an enormous responsibility. It's the nature of all teaching, all education, to change people, to transform people. But in this kind of teaching, the responsibility becomes much more evident because there are additional factors. to the normal situation of the classroom. One additional factor is that the kind of transformative learning involved takes the learner beyond the classroom into experiences which they might not normally expect from education. The water crisis students went out into the community and got themselves involved with the local radio and got interactions with people and so on. So this kind of learning and this kind of teaching takes students outside and beyond the classroom. Should they know this in advance? Should there be, to use a phrase from the world of research, informed consent? Because this is going to be something that they might not expect. So what do we mean by informed consent? The problem with the idea that we give them informed consent is that the very nature of transformation is such that learners cannot know, learners or their parents, when we're talking about young learners, but learners cannot know in advance, cannot be informed about what they will experience. Teachers, again, have to take responsibility. Teachers have to take a heavy responsibility, and they'll be able to draw on help from a professional body of other teachers in the school that we're working with and a professional model framework. So language teachers ought to be prepared for this, ought to be trained for this. It's something that we haven't yet done in language teaching to any great extent. It's something that the profession needs to think more about. The second element of the transformation is that the young people are going to change society. In a small way, we're not talking about revolution here, but we are talking about what some people call critical pedagogy, different ways of talking about this. And in this new situation where they are sent by their teachers beyond the classroom, they're nonetheless still the responsibility of the teacher, and they are exposed to risks. They engage with strangers about controversial issues. It can be argued that there should be warnings to learners and their parents or guardians. But again, there can be no simple answers about whether you can warn people in advance, how you can explain to them in advance, whether that's possible. That's an issue which needs a lot more thought, but it's certainly something which needs to be shared with other teachers. It also depends, all of this depends on the relationship with the teacher's employer. In some countries, the teacher's employer is the school. In some countries, it's the state. There is also a particular relationship here which has to be brought into the situation. I don't know what the situation is in Taiwan and who the employers of teachers, whether schools or universities, who those employers are in Taiwan. But in some cases, one is encouraging students to think critically, to challenge what the state has put in place. And that's an interesting and difficult issue. So all I've got is questions, which we have to think about and find answers to together. It raises questions about professional identity. In such discussions that I'm having with you now, language teachers may begin to think about their professional identity. There are many who respond, when I've been talking about this in other places, by saying, that's too much. Language teachers are not social science teachers. They've not been trained to work this way. I'm a language teacher. Is this language teaching? Is this really language teaching? Well, I have an answer to that question. I have a twofold answer, both a practical and philosophical. On a practical level, we know that the most efficient way of teaching and learning a language is to use it to teach other subjects. In the United States, it's called content-based instruction. In Europe, it's called content and language integrated learning, LIL. In other words, a teacher of biology teaches biology in the foreign language. That teacher needs to be able to speak the foreign language, of course. And that needs all kinds of special training. But we know, and there's been lots of experience of this in the United States and in Europe for many years, that this is a very efficient way of not just teaching biology, but of improving foreign language competence. So what's happening in the example I gave of the water crisis being taught in the language classroom, and other examples which I could give, but I don't have time to do that, is that the principles of LIL, or content-based instruction, are being transferred into the language classroom. The language classroom has got challenging topics, cognitively challenging and educationally valuable topics. The language is implicitly important, but implicitly, and the language competence improvement takes place implicitly in those events. I'm not saying that all language teaching should be like this. There will be some language teaching which is focusing upon language, upon grammar and reading and comprehension and all the things we know about. But in a project, the focus is a CLIL type focus, a content-based instruction type focus. The focus is upon the content and the cognitive challenge and the three orientations that I mentioned: the cognitive, the evaluative, and the action orientation. On a philosophical level, where languages are a school subject, where languages are part of general education, and in some cases may have very little instrumental value. If you learn French in England, then it won't have much instrumental value, or Spanish in Germany. English is always different, of course. English as a foreign language will always have instrumental value. But for many people, many language learners, other languages are not going to have very much instrumental value. And in that situation, language teaching should have educational value. It should, like other subjects, and in cooperation with other subjects, teach criticality, democratic and intercultural values, autonomy, all those elements of Bildung and intercultural citizenship, which I've been emphasizing. In this perspective, language teachers are not just instructors who deliver a curriculum of communicative competence or even intercultural communicative competence. They're language educators, not just instructors. They enrich learners' views of themselves, their societies, their cultures, and their languages. Many learners will lose their language competence. On the other hand, we hope that they remember and benefit from the critical transformative learning which turned their gaze outwards, beyond the confines of their own lives and societies. In the usual run of things, their teachers will never know if they've been successful in this way, and that's sometimes difficult to accept. It's only sometime in the future, when they've left you, that all that they've learned from you educationally will be valuable to them. Because education is more than the measurable and the testable instilling of skills and knowledge. Education is a leap of faith, if you like, and to become a teacher of intercultural citizenship, what I would call a language teacher plus, remains a leap of faith. I can offer no certainty on that, but I hope that those who change from being a language teacher in the narrow sense to a teacher of intercultural citizenship will take that leap, of faith. It's time to make a conclusion. I have no conclusion. But there are many other issues which I haven't got time to raise in detail today. For example, there's the whole question of the judgment in behaviors and the judgment of values and behaviors that we make and which is part of intercultural competence and intercultural citizenship. There's a whole question of relativism and universalism, of whether we say other people have the right to make their own judgments, or whether there are some kind of universal standards by which we judge behaviors and values. That's a big issue for another day. The whole question of teacher identity, what I just raised briefly, that too has many implications for teacher training and for teacher development. The teacher relationship with society and employer, which I mentioned in passing a moment ago, that too needs to be thought about and discussed, not least in teacher education. The whole question of learner identity. Do learners in the course of intercultural citizenship gain new identities? Is it a matter of developing national citizenship or international citizenship? National identity or international identity? All of that can be linked to the whole discussion of internationalism, which I don't have time really to deal with today. So I have a bibliography and that will be made available, but I don't have simple conclusions. All I can do today is raise questions with you, ask you to make perhaps the leap of faith and think that language teaching is not just language teaching, but is language teaching plus and has educational value. And that will stimulate some further thoughts in your work on a practical level and on a philosophical level. Thank you very much.